folks, welcome back. This is Joel, and we will continue with our discussion on ISE. We'll actually kick it up a notch in this one and move ahead with the guest access, right? Guest access is really very important in an enterprise network, and ISE really makes it easy to deploy this in probably like in few minutes, right? So the topology remains the same. I have a switch, right? This is my NAD, right? Network access device. Then I have a ISE and I have a domain controller where I have my whole NTP, DNS, certificate authority, AD, and everything down here, right? So the client is here, and this is the client with which we'll be doing all our testing. We'll obviously be looking into the guest access from a wired perspective, but the wireless is also almost going to be the same. So if you get this part, it's the wireless is like 90% same as this, right? So it's going to be pretty simple. So that being said, coming to the guest access. All right, so till now, if you have followed my series till now, right, we have mainly talked around 802.1x and MAMP, right? These were the two authentication methods which we looked into, right? Now there is another one which we have not looked into, which is the webauth, right? So webauth is another interesting authentication method, right? Which uses obviously your HTTP and HTTPS. It in fact allows the user access after authentication, right? So it's typically mainly used for your guest networks, right? So when I say guest, it's mainly when you have an organization, you have an enterprise, right? And you have some user coming into your enterprise, right? So you can't expect that user to have a .1x account, right? So he's not going to have a username and password, right? Because he's a guest, right? And also at the same time, his MAC address will not be present in the ID store, right? So his MAC address is also not going to be present. So you need a way to authenticate or to let a user into a network when they don't have either of this, right? So that's where your webauth comes into play. Now in webauth, right, one thing which you'll always hear repeatedly is, in fact, two things. One is your portal and the other one is your URL redirection. These are two terms which kind of like you hear left and right when you're looking into webauth. Now portal is basically nothing but a web portal, generally a HTML portal, right, where you have to put in your username and password or accept some kind of a policy so that they let you into the network, right? So if you have if you have observed how the internet is actually provided at airports, right, or maybe in a Starbucks cafe, right? So you basically see that when you connect to the SSID, right, you basically get a web portal where you have to put in your stuffs, right? So that's your web portal, nothing very fancy here. URL redirection, this is something interesting, right? So here what we do is or maybe I'll talk about this when we actually double click on CWA. For now, just think that we have two interesting pieces which constitutes or which two interesting pieces which you'll always hear when you talk about your webauth, right? Now these two features are not just used in your webauth, but they are also used, they're not just used in your guest access, but they are used pretty much in almost 5-6 other use cases in ISE, right? So if you have heard about things like client software provisioning, right? So if you want to like automatically provision some kind of a software for some user who is connecting to your network, right? So in that case also you need to have a portal and you'll have to do some URL redirection, right? Or if you want to do some kind of a BYOD onboarding, right? We probably will cover BYOD in future, but if you want to do some BYOD onboarding, right? So in that case you probably will have to do the same thing. You'll have to, as soon as the user comes in, you'll have to send him to a redirect and send him to a portal, right? We do the similar thing in your MDM redirect as well. MDM is more like your mobile device management, right? So mobile device management kind of enables Cisco ISE to integrate with industry standard MDM solutions, right? so that your mobile devices which are coming to the network, right, they have some compliance, right, so they meet some compliance assessment, right. So these are some use cases where you will see this portal and URL redirection as well, right. But that being said, the the focus of our discussion, obviously the other one is your guest access here, right, and that is going to be the focus of our discussion today. We'll probably talk about the rest of the stuff maybe in future, but for now or for today it's going to be the guest access. All right, now along with that, the other stuff which probably I want to also cover is that when you talk about webauth, right, there are different let's say there are mainly two different ways of doing this. One is called as central webauth, right, CWA, and the other one is your local webauth, right. So let me probably take an example to explain this, right. So this is how it works. You have your NAD device, your switch, right. So let's call this as your NAD. You have your mobile phone, right, over here, and then probably you have let's say maybe your internet router here, and you have your ISE over here, right, for a minute, right. So what happens is that in your web authentication, forget about CW and LWA, think about web authentication, right. What happens is you have the user over here, he wants to browse the internet because the internet is here, right. Let me just, all of this is connected, and this is the internet, right. So from here you are basically sent out to the internet. Now as a guy who goes to a Starbucks cafe, I want to probably check my email, so I want to connect to the internet. So I'm sitting down here, so I'm gonna switch on, I'm gonna connect to a guest SSID, right, the SSID which is broadcasted probably by a WLC. In that case the NAD becomes a WLC, or probably a wired connection, right. Very rare, I don't think anyone would give a wired connection in a cafe, but for an example, right. So I'm going to connect to the network. So when I'm connecting to the network, what happens is, or in web authentication, because like I said, you really can't have .1x and map to authenticate this user who's coming into your network. You need a very interesting way to do this. So the first step is basically the browser, right. So the user is obviously gonna, 99% of the time the user is gonna open his any kind of an app or probably browser, right, and most of the apps and the browsers, they basically use HTTP and HTTPS. So what we do is, right, when he's trying to access HTTP traffic, this NAD, right, we do a bit of configuration on the NAD to redirect that traffic directly onto your ISE, right. His intention is actually to go like this, right, go to the internet. He wants to check his Facebook or Twitter, right, but what we do is, using this NAD, we redirect that traffic, that HTTP traffic, we redirect it up to the ISE, right. And once it is going up to the ISE, on the ISE, so when I say redirect, we redirect it to a portal. So that's where I'm trying to make all the connections. So we redirect it to the portal, and this is the redirection, right. So look at me trying to tie all the pieces here. So on the NAD, we put in a bit of configuration using ACL, where we say, what, when the user is connecting to any website, right, for the first time, right, let's take the traffic and let's redirect it to a portal, right, a portal. So you will have a portal which is set up. It could be on ISE or it could be somewhere else. For a minute, let's assume it's on ISE itself. So you have a small portal here, and we are redirecting the traffic, and that's how you get that initial screen, right, which basically says, okay, this is the place. You have to either put your username, password, or sometimes it tells you don't even have to do the username, password. It will just ask you for a ask that you basically confirm with the policies of that place or something like that. Once you do the action, right, that you basically once you do the action on that particular portal, right, you are admitted into the network, right. So it basically starts a timer sometimes, and you're basically redirected. So using COA, obviously, change of authorization, right, your access is no longer restricted, or your NAD, right, we no longer redirect your traffic. It will no longer restrict access, right. It will say, okay, you have authenticated, now you are good to go and connect to the internet, or go and browse the internet. So that's your web authentication in a nutshell, right. Now there are two ways to do this. One is obviously I can host this portal directly on my NAD over here, right? So that becomes your local web authentication, because in that case the client doesn't have to really reach up to the ISE, right? This web portal can be hosted on the switch itself, right? And if it's a very, very small cafe, I really don't understand the point of having probably an ISE. In that case, I would probably have a small switch and host the web portal here, because I'll probably not even get a lot of users, right? So in that case, I can have the web portal here, probably, so I can do that. That will be basically your local web authentication. But it's kind of a bit of an old technology, I would say. People were doing that for a long time. With central web authentication, you are basically moving this web portal from your NAD to your ISE. So now imagine I can host the web portal here, and my whole organization, right? Imagine if you're working in a big company and you probably have like visitors coming in and day out, right? So you probably have hundreds of users, hundreds of visitors, guests coming into your network. So you're gonna have a lot of clients like this. It's not just gonna be one client, and this one switch will not be able to handle it. So in that case, you can probably host the whole web page or web portal down on your ISE. Do the same thing. You do the URL redirection from here. The authentication request goes up here. Then you either have a pre-configured username password, or probably you want to give your internet for free. You can do that, and then there's a change of authorization sent back, and the NAD will now permit all the access to the internet, right? So that's mainly what web authentication is, and what CWA and your this thing, what is that, LWA, which is your local web authentication is, right? Hope that is clear. Okay, I'm terrible with erasing stuff, give me a second. So that being said, let me actually take a minute to actually spend one more minute to take an example and explain how the whole CWA again works. So you have your client here, right? I want to cover all the steps and not miss out, because this is something very interesting and very important, right? Probably the same example. I have my client, I have my NAD, which is like a switch, and probably my ISE here. Step one, right? The initial packet comes in here, right? The packet comes in, and imagine for a minute, I don't have .1x on this one, right? I can have .1x as well. I can take care of that, because probably let's imagine a visitor comes to your company, right, into your enterprise, and you can't expect all your visitors to have their .1x turned off. Probably not. So probably they have their supplicant turned on, in which case also it works. But for a minute, for simplicity, let's assume that he has the .1x turned off, which means the only possible authentication is using MAB, right? So the NAD will pick up the MAC address and will send a MAB request here, right? So the MAB request, like we have covered in the previous videos, is sent up to the ISE. Now ISE looks at this MAP request and says, boss, this particular MAC address which you are trying to search is not there in my directory, right? Or it's not there in my identity source, because obviously this guy is a guest, right? You can't expect to have that MAC address over here in his database. So he's going to say, no, I don't have it. But what we do here is, you will see that when I show you the configurations later, what we do is we do a small hacky way. What we say is, even if you don't find the user, right? Even if you don't find the user or even if you don't find the MAC address, right, for MAB, don't cancel the request. Don't drop the request. Do continue, right? That's kind of like a tweak which we do, right? Till now in my previous videos you would have seen, if MAP doesn't work, if .1x doesn't work, then the request is dropped. We no longer entertain those requests. But when you have to take care of guest networks, that is what you do. You either take .1x or you take MAB request, but you don't drop it, right? You have a specific action, right, called as continue, and I'll show you that when doing the authentication policy. But you select that continue, and you basically make the ISE, to not drop the request, rather continue it. Now, once the request is continued, what I mean by that is the authorization policy kicks in, because authentication policy has been continued, which means the corresponding authorization policy will kick in. So the authorization policy will be something like, there is going to be a limited ACL returned DACL, basically a DACL, right? This is nothing but a DACL, a limited ACL, plus the URL redirect, right? The URL redirect which I was talking about, that is also returned as part of the authorization itself. Now the NAD receives this, and obviously that is communicated back to the client, right? And obviously the ACL is going to be this ACL is going to be now used for this session right over here, because it's a DACL, right? So now the client really can't access anything in the network because of the ACL, right? This ACL will deny everything, which means the client really can't go out to the internet right now. His only option is to use this URL redirect, right? And probably either he is trying to access something like google.com. What happens is, because of this ACL redirect which is present on NAD now, this particular HTTP traffic, web traffic, right, will get redirected to the portal which is there here, right? The web portal, the username password portal, right? So it gets redirected. So when I say redirected, so he's trying to access google.com, but he doesn't get google.com, rather he'll get a ISE login page here, right? Now the only option he has is obviously to fill up the form. Now this would basically, the options which you see on this form will vary depending on different types of guest access, right? There are a lot of variants, but for now just imagine a simple username password or something like register, create your account, accept policy, something like that, right? You get a very simple login page. So the user obviously now his only option, like I said, is going to create an account, right? Probably create an account, and then as soon as you create an account, sometimes you get a message, right? So you get a message, or you sometimes get an email, right? That credentials, or probably it might be shown directly on your phone immediately as well. Whatever it is, now you take that username password, you basically go back and log in, right, using that username password. Now ISE sees that okay, the user is trying to connect to the web portal using the username password, and ISE obviously is the one who gave you this username password, so he knows that, so he is going to authenticate you. So he's gonna say, okay, this looks good, right? So now there is a second authorization policy which kicks in. So always remember, in CW you always have two authorization policies. This was your first one, right? So the second one will kick in now. So the ISE will basically see that, okay, the username password which the user has entered is correct. So let's go and authorize, right? Or let's elevate the permissions for this particular user. So now you'll get probably initially you got a limited ACL. Now you'll get a better ACL. Let's keep it simple and let's call it as a better ACL, right? So that you get more access into the network, right? Now also always remember that this session is already up there, right? So this session is already out there, right? So it won't break the existing session. So it has to apply this better ACL on the existing session. So how do you think ISE will do that? Yes, you guessed it right, COA. So that's where COA comes into picture. So now ISE will use COA, that is a change of authorization, to apply a better ACL, right, to the existing session, right? So that you basically have full access to the network, right? So the COA basically will kind of like force a reauth, right? So when you do a configuration, you'll understand that the COA kind of like does a reauth, right? So it will do a reauth here, and then you'll basically end up getting a complete or a better or a full access into the network. So that's the whole various steps involved when it comes to, let me just draw a line here, I think otherwise it's confusing, right? So that's basically the various steps involved, right, from the client, from the NAD, and from the ISE perspective. I'm terrible with my drawings, but hope I was at least that gave you an idea. I mean, I don't expect this to be a complete session. Like I said, this is a very overview kind of a thing, right? And I expect you guys to probably have a look at the design guides to understand more. But I really like explaining a bunch of things before we get into the labs. Now that being said, what we'll do in the lab is, like I was saying, there are different variants of guest access. The first one, which probably we'll be looking into, is the I believe it's hotspot, right? So we'll look into hotspot, which is the first one. Second one is your which one do we look into the second? It's going to be a self registration. I'll explain this, don't worry. Self registration, Third one is your self-registration plus sponsor. I'll just call that as for now. And the fourth one is sponsored. Right? Now, what are each of these? So in hotspot, what we do is we generally don't want the user to create an account, put in a username, password. Right? Think of hotspot as a very generous way of giving internet. Right? The login page will just have one small checkbox generally saying that you approve of, there'll be some kind of a small policy, and you'll have to just check put in a checkbox over here, and you're basically saying that I approve, of all the policy which is here written, and then you're immediately given access to the network. So that's your hotspot. Right? Self-registration is generally where you have like a username, password, right? And you have an option like something like register, right? And when you click on the register, another page opens up where you kind of have to put in a username, first name, second name, email ID, phone number, and all of that. And then you probably will get a reply, either on an email or a SMS, right, with the corresponding username and password which you can use to log into the network. But why is it called self-registration? Because you are doing everything on your own, right? You are only registering, and the username and password which you get out of that, you are using it for connecting to the network. Now, the difference with the next one is basically self-registration plus sponsor. So here what happens is, in guest access, there are certain actors called as sponsors. Sponsors are just like your guests, right? Just like guest is an actor, sponsor is an actor. So sponsor is someone who is generally part of the enterprise, part of the network, and who has access to approve or deny any of the requests, right? So in this particular case, what's going to happen is the client or the guest who comes in is going to use the same mechanism like I showed you in the previous one here to create an account, register and create an account and all of that. But he will not be able to access the network until a sponsor, right, who is part of the network, part of the enterprise probably, or maybe a part of a small admin group, will have to approve the request, right? So he'll probably get a notification. The sponsor will get a notification in an SMS or an email, or there's also a portal called as sponsor portal itself, right? So he can go up to the sponsor portal and he can, approve or deny a particular request. So that's the difference between 2 and 3. Now, I think you probably guessed by now what is the final one, which is your, sponsored. So till now, right, forget about hotspot, you don't even have username, password. But in 2 and 3, the guest himself was creating the username, password, right? But in case of sponsored way of doing it, the guest can't do anything. He can't create a username, password. The sponsor himself will have to log into what we call as a sponsor portal, and will have to create a username and password for the guest. So it's something like, maybe if you're visiting your friend, right, probably next week, you can probably message him today that you're probably going to visit him on this day, right, at this time, right, and he can proactively go and kind of like create an account for you, right, on that particular time, so that it's all ready, right? As soon as you enter the enterprise, right, you can probably get an email or a message saying that this is your username and password, right? So in this approach, the client doesn't have privilege to create any username and passwords. Rather, the sponsor creates it, and the access is pretty much the same in all these 4 methods, right? The way you access the network is pretty much the same. Your traffic, the first part of the traffic, HTTP traffic, will get redirected, right, onto your will get redirected to the ISE login page, and based on whatever it is, hotspot, registration, or the third one and the fourth one, right, that's where it's going to deviate, right, and the workflow will change basically, right? So enough of theory, and I think I'll probably stop this video now here, and do watch for the next video where I'll put in all these 4 variants, right? We are gonna do the configurations on our setup, and we are gonna check out how cool and how simple it is to set all of this up within like few minutes. Thanks guys for watching, and have a good day.